Welcome to our next set of lectures in NO 105. This time, we look at the issue of healthcare in North America. Healthcare is an incredibly important public policy issue across the continent. It's interesting for us in this course for a couple of key reasons. First, it demonstrates how different approaches and attitudes towards the development and delivery of healthcare have emerged in North America. And second, it reveals a particular, maybe even peculiar fixation on the issue of healthcare in Canada as it relates to the construction of this country's national identity. Before launching right into the policy implications of the various debates around healthcare, let's first look more closely into the life of Tommy Douglas, a Canadian political leader who more than anyone else in Canada is associated with this issue of healthcare. He is, in fact, generally considered to be the father of Canada's system of universal healthcare. Thomas Douglas, or Tommy Douglas, as he's popularly known, was born in Falkirk, Scotland in 1904. His father was a veteran of the Boer or South African War, one of Britain's various colonial conflicts that took place at the beginning of the 20th century. His dad was also a skilled tradesman. In 1910, the family left Scotland and immigrated to Canada. They briefly returned to Scotland during the First World War, but by 1918 they had come back to Canada for good, and they had settled in the prairie city of Winnipeg. One of Douglas's most formative life experiences happened as a very young child. Before the family had left Scotland the first time, he fell and hurt his right leg. Infection and inflammation of the bones set in, and he underwent a number of operations to try to resolve the condition. But then, later in Winnipeg, the difficulty with his leg returned. At the age of 10, Douglas was sent to hospital. There, doctors told his parents that the leg would need to be amputated before the infection spread elsewhere. The reality was that his parents could simply not afford the cost of the specialists that would be required to treat him. Luckily, a visiting and well-known orthopedic surgeon took interest in his case and offered to treat the boy for free, provided that his medical students were allowed to learn from the case. It would take another series of operations, but in the end, his leg was saved. The whole episode undoubtedly contributed to Douglas's later belief that healthcare should be equitable and publicly funded. In an often quoted interview he gave much later in life, Douglas said, "I felt that no boy should have to depend either for his leg or his life upon the ability of his parents to raise enough money to bring a first-class surgeon to his bedside." Douglas grew up in a very working-class family that struggled financially. He managed to finish elementary school during the family's brief return to Scotland, but then took on jobs to help support his parents. At the age of 13, he even left high school altogether to work in a cork factory. Once back in Canada, Douglas successfully completed an apprenticeship as a printing press operator, becoming a fully qualified tradesman. Undoubtedly, his working-class education in the trades was supplemented by what he learned from the streets of Winnipeg. In the spring of 1919, the Winnipeg General Strike broke out. Practically the entire city came to a standstill, when tens of thousands of workers in both the public and private sectors totally walked off the job, including the fire department. Remember, we spoke about this episode earlier when we were examining labor and migration in North America as a topic in the course. From the rooftop of a downtown building, Douglas was actually witness to the violence of what would come to be known as Bloody Saturday, when the Royal Northwest Mounted Police charged into an assembled crowd of striking workers. They beat them and they fired their weapons. Countless people were injured or arrested, and 2 of the strikers were actually killed. Days later, the strike was called off by the workers who were organizing it, but their point had been made. It would go down as the largest general strike in Canadian history. It may well be these formative years growing up in Winnipeg, his earliest life experiences, that contributed to a lifelong commitment of what can be called democratic socialism. The idea is often used quite generally, so it can be difficult to precisely define. But in relation to Douglas, democratic socialism means a system of political beliefs that is compatible with capitalism. It seeks to reform the capitalist system, not abolish it. Democratic socialism also promotes the welfare state and some form of fiscal redistribution to assist the less prosperous in society, the poor, working and otherwise, the elderly and the sick, by providing state resources, such as pensions or maybe on employment insurance, for example. With qualifications as a skilled tradesman
Bria, I'm trying to find
hand,
a good razor bump thing, and it turns out I told you my Sephora order got returned again, right?
An ordained minister. In 1924, he enrolled at Brandon College. At the time, this was a Baptist school in Manitoba, associated with McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario.
How did that happen?
Here, he completed
I don't know, they
high
keep
school
saying they can't find
and
the
began
address.
to study theology. He took courses in socialism that no doubt further contributed to his own political beliefs. He was also exposed to professors who challenged their students to think beyond strict or fundamentalist interpretations of the Bible. They taught from the perspective of the social gospel movement. Social gospelers believed that Christian principles should inform social changes to Canadian society. In other words, Christians should not be concerned only with salvation of souls. They should also fight for social justice in the here and now. You can really see how that line of thinking would resonate for Douglas and shape much of what he would do later in life. Douglas paid his way through school by serving as a minister at various rural churches in Manitoba, delivering sermons that encouraged his congregation to help the poor. It was while he was on this rural preaching circuit that he met his wife, Irma Dempsey. The two settled in the town of Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and Douglas served as an ordained minister at the Calvary Baptist Church. They arrived here just as the Great Depression of the 1930s was taking hold, and their community was in an area that was one of the hardest hit in the country. The hardships Douglas witnessed convinced him that only political action could alleviate the suffering Canadians were experiencing. So he joined the Socialist Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or CCF, and he won a seat in the federal election of 1935. For almost the next 10 years, he would serve as a federal member of parliament, working closely with J.S. Woodsworth, the first leader of the CCF and a pioneer in Canada's social democratic movement. Douglas and Woodsworth did not always agree on issues. Woodsworth was an ardent pacifist who had even spoken out against the Canadian decision to go to war when the Second World War broke out. Douglas, on the other hand, was less idealistic, arguing that at times it was necessary to use force to protect certain fundamental rights. Still, his respect for Woodsworth was profound. He actually held and turned the pages of the speech arguing against Canadian participation in World War II that his political leader and mentor delivered. Though he stayed on in federal politics as a CCF member of parliament until he resigned his seat in the House of Commons in June 1944, by the early 1940s, he was becoming increasingly engaged with provincial politics in Saskatchewan. In 1942, he challenged and defeated the provincial leader of the CCF, and then led the party in a provincial election just 2 years later. It was a resounding victory, with the CCF winning 47 of the 53 seats in the provincial legislature. Douglas had formed the first democratic socialist government in Canada. His government was innovative and efficient. 100 bills were passed in just his first term. Notably, the CCF developed Saskatchewan's infrastructure. It paid down its provincial debt, and it passed labor legislation. Douglas remained premier for the next 17 years. The most notable of all his achievements, though, and the one most relevant for our lecture and course, was his advocacy and achievement of universal health care legislation. Under Douglas, this legislation was introduced in 1961. It led to a difficult and very hard-fought struggle with the medical establishment. Doctors were outraged that the government would interfere in the delivery of medical care. They also feared that they might face a significant loss of income. In spite of government assurances that their income would in fact remain the same, the province's doctors went on strike in 1962. Initially, some 90% of doctors shut their offices, but the government brought in outside doctors from other provinces in the United States to serve as clinics. Within a few weeks, Saskatchewan's doctors were returning to work, and a settlement with them was reached. Within just 3 years, most doctors had come to favor the new system. Having started the ball rolling, Tommy Douglas left provincial politics in 1961 to return to federal politics. At the time, the CCF was undergoing a transformation into the New Democratic Party that we have today, and Douglas was chosen as its new leader in the very first NDP leadership convention. He would go on to lead the NDP for the next decade, and remained a member of parliament until he retired from politics altogether in 1979. While his party never formed a government at the federal level, he was an effective leader, and he had considerable influence when the Liberal Party was forced to rely on his support and the support of the NDP, while the Liberals had a minority government in the 1960s. Douglas could take some satisfaction from the fact that the Liberals and progressive conservative governments of his day were quick to recognize the popularity of some of his ideas, and they were not above borrowing these. It would be Lester Pearson, for example, who finally brings about a national program of Medicare. But for most Canadians, Tommy Douglas's association with healthcare is firmly entrenched. When the CBC ran a Greatest Canadian contest, it was Douglas who rose to the top. Canadians do
I'm gonna say like
their
May 9th
universal healthcare.
because I'm
And in the
I'm
next part of
supposed
the
to be
lecture,
going on
we'll
vacation.
explore just how the system works. That's it for part 1. We'll see you in part 2. Bye for now.